I grew up in Abilene, Texas, a place where nothing much happens except for the occasional high school football game or county fair. It's the kind of town where folks gather at the same diner every morning, sipping black coffee and talking about nothing in particular. By the time I was 20, I was already restless, desperate for something, anything, to break the monotony of small-town life. That's how I ended up in a car that summer night with Claire, Tyler, and Jessica, chasing a story that should have stayed just that, a story. It was one of those nights where the air sat thick and unmoving, the heat lingering long after the sun had set. We had been aimlessly cruising through town, windows down, letting the warm breeze carry away the boredom. The radio buzzed with static before Tyler finally shut it off with a grunt. "You guys ever heard of the old Fairfield Cemetery?" he asked, leaning forward from the back seat. Jessica, sitting beside him, wrinkled her nose. "Isn't that the one out past Route 83? The one they say is haunted?" Tyler grinned. "That's the one. My uncle swears he saw something out there when he was a kid. Some kind of ritual." Claire shot me a look, the dim glow from the dashboard reflecting in her dark eyes. Oh great, another one of Tyler's ghost stories. But I wasn't so quick to brush it off. Out here, in a town where even Walmart closed early, the idea of stepping into something eerie was more thrilling than frightening. "Let's go," I said, turning the wheel sharply. The road leading to the cemetery wasn't really a road, more like a barely there trail, worn down by time and neglect. My headlights barely pierced through the dense thicket of oak and mesquite trees, their gnarled branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No cicadas, no crickets, just the crunch of gravel under my tires. By the time we reached the rusted cemetery gate, a strange mist had begun to creep along the ground, swirling between the crooked tombstones. My stomach twisted. Texas didn't get fog like this. Something about this place felt colder, like the ground itself had never quite let go of the dead buried beneath it. Then Jessica froze. She wasn't looking at the headstones anymore. She was looking past them, toward the far end of the graveyard, where the mist seemed to be moving. I followed her gaze, my breath catching in my throat. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the fog curled and shifted in the moon's dim glow, but then I saw it. Them, 4 figures draped in white robes, moving in a slow, deliberate circle around a single grave. Their movements were rhythmic, almost ceremonial. No voices, no chanting, just the eerie, soundless synchronization of their steps. Claire gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What the hell is that?" Nobody answered. Nobody moved. Then, as if sensing us, one of them stopped. My pulse hammered as the figure slowly turned its hooded head in our direction. Even from this distance I could see the pale sliver of a face beneath the fabric, but something was off, like my brain refused to process what I was seeing. My legs finally caught up with my fear. I grabbed Claire's hand, whispering, "We need to go, now." Tyler and Jessica nodded, their faces pale as ghosts. We backed away carefully, our footsteps crunching against the dry earth. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly, like prey avoiding the gaze of a predator. The second we reached the car, all hell broke loose. Tyler yanked at the door handle, cursing when it stuck. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, nearly dropping them into the dirt. Then, a sound. Not footsteps, not voices, just a low, hollow exhale, like something breathing right behind me. I didn't look back. The engine roared to life and I slammed the car into reverse, the tires skidding against the loose gravel. In the rearview mirror I saw the figures standing at the gate, unmoving, watching. And just before we rounded the bend, disappearing back into the safety of the trees, I swear to God, one of them lifted a hand and waved. We didn't talk on the drive back, didn't stop, didn't check the mirrors. The only time I let myself breathe was when we pulled into the gas station on the edge of town, the bright fluorescent lights grounding me back to reality. Tyler's hands were still clenched into white-knuckled fists. Jessica was trembling. Claire just stared at me, her lips slightly parted, as if waiting for me to explain what the hell we had just witnessed. I had no answers, and we never went back. But sometimes, in the dead quiet of the night, when I close my eyes and let my mind wander, I can still see that pale, half-hidden face, and I can still feel the weight of that silent wave, like a reminder, like a warning. We never talked about Fairfield Cemetery after that night. It was an unspoken rule, a shared silence between us. I think we all knew deep down that whatever we saw wasn't meant for us. Some nights I still dream about that place, the creeping mist, the silent figures, the way one of them lifted a hand as if acknowledging us. I tell myself it was just a trick of the fog, a distortion of fear, but I know better. It's funny how the mind works. You think you can leave things behind, bury them deep, but they have a way of crawling back up when you least expect them. That's why when Emily told me her story, years later, in the dead quiet of a road trip, I felt something cold settle in my chest, the same kind of cold I'd felt that night in the cemetery. It was late July. She had been driving home with her kids after visiting family in Houston. The sky was black, empty of stars, the kind of night where the world feels too big, too hollow. Her son Ethan, 7, was fighting with his little sister Lily over a tablet, their voices sharp and relentless in the confined space of the car. Emily's patience was stretched thin, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tight enough to make her knuckles ache. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She pulled the car onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The road was deserted, lined with towering pines that swayed lazily in the night breeze. She turned on the hazard lights, turned in her seat and gave them the look, the one every mother has, the silent warning of enough. "Both of you need to calm down," she said, her voice tight. "It's late, I'm tired, and we're not going anywhere until you stop fighting." They quieted, though Ethan still shot a glare at his sister. Lily crossed her arms, pouting. Emily exhaled, rubbed her temples, and was just about to put the car back in drive when she noticed something. A pair of headlights creeping up behind her. She tensed, watching in the rearview mirror as the car slowed to a stop beside hers. It was an older model sedan, the kind you'd see in old crime movies, its paint faded under the dim glow of her hazard lights. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man with salt and pepper stubble, his eyes shadowed in the darkness. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice smooth, too casual. "Everything all right?" Emily hesitated. She had grown up in Texas, where people stopped to help strangers on the road all the time. But something about this, about him, made her skin prickle. She forced a polite smile. "Yeah, just had to settle the kids down." The man nodded. "Got kids of my own. I know how it is." The woman in the passenger seat leaned forward then, her short-cropped blonde hair catching the light. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "We just wanted to warn you," she said. "There's a bad wreck up ahead. Might be easier to take a detour." Emily frowned. "A wreck?" "Yeah," the man gestured vaguely behind him. "Happened just over the next hill. Traffic's backed up for miles. You'd save yourself a lot of trouble if you took the old side. But I think I'll just stay on the main road." The woman's smile didn't falter, but Emily swore she saw the man's fingers tighten on the steering wheel. He nodded once, too slow, like he was deciding something. Then just as smoothly as they had arrived, they pulled away, disappearing into the night. Emily sat there for a moment, her heart hammering. Her gut told her to turn around, go back to the last gas station, but that would add another 30 minutes to their drive, and the kids were already exhausted, so she drove forward. The hill came and went, and just as she'd suspected, there was no wreck. No skid marks, no broken glass, no sign that anything had ever happened. The road stretched on, empty and undisturbed. That's when she saw it. Off to the right, tucked into a narrow dirt path, was the same sedan, the same one that had warned her about the accident. The car was parked, its engine still running, its headlights casting long shadows into the trees. And the couple? They were standing outside, facing the woods. Not moving, not speaking, just standing there, their backs to the road, staring into the blackness between the trees as if something was staring back. A cold wave of terror crashed through her. She pressed the gas pedal hard, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she sped past them. She didn't dare look back. Didn't slow down until the glow of a distant gas station came into view, its fluorescent lights cutting through the night like a beacon. Only then did she let herself breathe. The next morning, curiosity got the better of her. She still had errands to run in the area, and in the safety of daylight she convinced herself she'd just imagined the whole thing. Maybe there really had been an accident, and she had just missed the aftermath. Maybe the couple had simply pulled over for their own reasons. So she drove back. The road looked different in the daylight, less menacing, less suffocating, but when she reached the dirt path where the sedan had been, she slowed, peering in, and that's when she saw the sign. A bright yellow placard, nailed haphazardly to a wooden post, the words painted in bold black letters, "Dead End." Emily sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it. There was no way out of that road, no connecting streets, just a stretch of dirt leading to nothing. So why had they wanted her to take it? She didn't know, and she never went back to find out. She told me this story years later, long after it happened. We were sitting in a rundown diner off I-20, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. The kind of place where the waitress had been working there so long, she didn't bother asking if you needed a refill. I remember staring at her across the table, feeling that same cold sensation creep through me, the one I'd felt when I saw that pale figure in the cemetery all those years ago. "There's something wrong with some roads," she murmured, stirring her coffee. "Some places just don't lead anywhere good." I nodded, because I understood, and deep down, I think we both knew some things are better left unexplained. Emily's story stayed with me. It clung to the edges of my mind like a dark stain, something that couldn't quite be scrubbed away. The way she described that couple, how their voices had been just a little too smooth, their directions a little too eager. It reminded me of Fairfield Cemetery, not in the way of ghosts or rituals, but in that gut-wrenching certainty that she had stumbled into something she was never meant to see. I had almost asked her if she ever dreamed about them, if she ever woke up with the feeling that they were still out there, standing motionless by that dead-end road, waiting for her to change her mind. But I didn't. Some things don't need to be spoken aloud. Some questions don't need answers. Maybe that's why, when David told me what happened to him, I felt that same slow creep of unease, the same feeling that had settled in my stomach when we backed away from those hooded figures in the cemetery, when Emily's tail lights disappeared into the night as she sped away from those strangers on the road. Like we were all brushing against something just beyond the veil, something we were lucky to escape. But how many close calls do you get before your luck runs out? David had been driving alone on Highway 20 in Oregon, making his way back to campus after a long weekend. It was a Sunday night, late enough that the highway was empty except for the occasional semi-truck rumbling past in the opposite direction. His phone had died hours ago, leaving him alone with the steady hum of his engine and the radio, which had dissolved into static as he moved further into the thick stretch of pine forest that lined the road. The gas station he had planned to stop at had been closed, its neon out-of-order sign blinking weakly in the dark. He figured he had enough fuel to make it another 20 miles. He was wrong. The car shuddered beneath him, the engine making a sickly choking sound before it died completely, leaving him coasting to a stop on the side of the road. He tried the ignition once, twice. Nothing. He sat there for a long moment, gripping the wheel, trying to will the car back to life. Then he glanced at his phone. No service. It was just him, and the road, and the trees. He locked the doors. David told me he had never realized how loud silence could be. He could hear his own breathing, the faint click of the cooling engine. And beyond that, nothing. No wind, no distant headlights, just an endless stretch of darkened forest, pressing in on both sides of the road. He told himself to wait, that someone would come, that if he just sat tight, a passing car or a tow truck would eventually pull over to help. Then he saw the movement. At first he thought it was an animal, a deer stepping cautiously out from the tree line, but it wasn't. It was a man, tall, thin, emerging slowly from the darkness like he had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to step forward. David's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The man's clothes were filthy, his hair long and unkempt, tangled around his face like he hadn't bathed in weeks. He walked with a slow, deliberate purpose, heading straight for the driver's side window. David barely had time to react before the man knocked, just once. A polite tap. David didn't move. The man cupped his hands against the glass, peering inside, his breath fogging up the window. David forced himself to meet his eyes. There was something wrong with them. Not just the wild, bloodshot look of someone who hadn't slept in days, but something deeper, like he wasn't seeing David, he was seeing through him. The man spoke. "Hey buddy, you okay?" David hesitated. He wanted to ignore him, to pretend he hadn't heard, but his pulse was hammering too fast, his adrenaline spiking too hard. The man knocked again, louder this time. "You gotta help me," the man said. His voice was raw, desperate. "I'm lost. I don't know how I got here." David's instinct screamed at him to stay silent, to stay still, but the man kept knocking, harder and harder, his breathing turning ragged. "Please, just open the door." David's stomach turned. Something about the way he said it, not "let me in," not "can you call for help," just "open the door," made every hair on his body stand on end. Then the headlights appeared, bright, blinding, coming up fast from behind. A police cruiser. The man froze. His face, so desperate before, changed in an instant. He took a step back, then another. The cruiser slowed, pulling up behind David's stalled car. A wave of relief washed over him. The officer stepped out, flashlight in hand, shining it first at David's car, then at the man. The man didn't move. "Sir," the officer called out, "everything okay here?" The man hesitated. Then, without a word, he turned and walked straight into the woods. Not hurried, not panicked, just gone. The officer knocked on David's window, motioning for him to roll it down. David's hands were still shaking as he explained what happened. The officer listened, his face unreadable, then nodded. "Let's get you out of here." David climbed into the cruiser, still shaken, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. On the drive to the nearest gas station, he glanced out the window, watching the trees blur past. He thought about that man, the way he had begged for help, the way he had changed the second the police arrived. David turned to the officer. "You see a lot of people like him out here?" The officer didn't answer right away. Then, finally, "Yeah, more than you'd think." David let that settle. He didn't ask any more questions, but later, after he had refueled and gotten back on the road, he kept checking his mirrors, kept waiting for the tall, thin figure to emerge again, stepping onto the pavement, watching him. I don't know what's worse, what we saw in the cemetery, the couple waiting by the dead-end road, or the man who knocked on David's window, pleading for him to open the door. Maybe none of it means anything. Maybe they were all just coincidences. But I don't believe in coincidences anymore, and neither does David. If there's one thing I've learned from these stories, mine, Emily's and David's, it's that some things are better left alone. Some places, some people, some moments in time aren't meant for us to understand. Maybe we were lucky. Maybe we walked away just in time. Or maybe something, someone let us go. I've spent a lot of nights replaying what happened in that cemetery, thinking about those hooded figures, the way one of them turned to acknowledge us, as if we had trespassed into something we were never meant to see. I've thought about Emily and the couple on the road, how they appeared out of nowhere with a detour that led to nowhere. And I've thought about David, stuck in the middle of the woods with a man who wasn't just lost, but looking for something. The more I think about it, the more I realize these stories aren't just about fear. They're about instinct. That gut feeling that tells you something isn't right. The cold sensation at the back of your neck when you know you're being watched. The way your body tenses before your mind even catches up to the danger. And the real lesson? You should always listen to it. If you ever find yourself on a lonely road at night and a stranger tells you to take a shortcut, don't take it. If your car breaks down and someone approaches out of the darkness knocking on your window, saying just open the door, don't open it. If you step into a place that feels wrong, that feels cold even in the heat of summer, and something stirs in the mist, turn around and leave. We grow up hearing stories about monsters, but the truth is the real dangers aren't always in the shadows. Sometimes they smile at you through a car window. Sometimes they pretend to be in distress. Sometimes they wave goodbye as you run from them. I don't know if we'll ever fully understand what we encountered, and honestly, I don't think I want to. Some mysteries should remain unsolved, but if these stories serve any purpose beyond a moment of fear, let it be this. Trust yourself. Trust that deep, primal part of you that senses danger before it arrives. Don't let curiosity pull you down a road you can't come back from. And whatever you do, never ignore the feeling that something is watching you, because sometimes it is. Before I go, I just want to thank you, whether you stumbled upon this story by accident or have been with me for a while. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, to let these stories sink in. Horror isn't just about scaring people. It's about reminding us of the things we push aside, the things we pretend don't exist. So thank you for being here, for letting me tell these stories, and for keeping your eyes open a little wider the next time you find yourself alone on the road at night. Stay safe, stay aware, and always trust your instincts.